I am so excited. Not just excited, possibly the most excited I have been this year to interview Judith Hoffman and Natalie Wexler. Let me tell you how revolutionary your book has been for me. So I discovered your book when I watched Natalie Wexler's video with Ed Webb in May. The second I learned about it, I went and got the book. That was in May, and at the end of May, I started planning for my unit in December for the next school year, based upon the writing revolution. And then I spent my summer, like when I did walks around my neighborhood, I would read every chapter. And then when I did presentations over the summer, I implemented your strategies right away in the presentations. And today I'm kind of feeling sick. I even went home early today to go projectile vomit into my toilet and take a nap. But I was thinking I will not cancel this podcast because I have Judith Hoffman and Natalie Wexler on the podcast. So that's how like important this podcast is to me today. So welcome to you both.
Oh, we're honored.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much.
Let's start with this. Can you please share a story about working with teachers and students that has really changed your practice?
Judy, you want to go first?
No, why don't you go first, Natalie, while I think about it a little bit more.
Well, I did think about it because I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a teacher. I'm a writer. So really for me, this question was, what have I observed as a writer or an education researcher, and not in the academic sense, that's changed my thinking, and specifically about writing. And there are a number of them, but I think basically what I've learned from working with Judy, going into classrooms, is how much we underestimate how difficult writing is for most students. And I write all the time, so to me it's almost like second nature. But so the memory that came to mind was I was visiting a school in Washington D.C. where I live that had partnered with the Writing Revolution organization, and so the teachers had been, not only read the book, but also had been getting some training and coaching. And I was in a classroom, and this, by the way, it was a high school that had a lot of multilingual learners. We have many multilingual learners in Washington, D.C. And the teacher was basically introducing them to the concept of writing a topic sentence for a paragraph, which, I think of that's the, kids do that, little kids do that, but it really requires a lot of analysis and the ability to generalize. And so what he was doing was just having them, now he was using a season, the fall, autumn, as a way of introducing this concept, because you don't want to have kids juggling some new concept along with a new grammatical concept. So he was introducing this in familiar content, and he just had kids like brainstorm whatever they thought could think about the fall. What happens in the fall? Well, the weather gets cooler, the leaves start changing color. They came up with all of these things. And then he said, he wrote all these things on the board, and he said, so, what do all these things, like, or not all of these things, but many of these things have in common? How could we come up with a sentence that describes many of these things? And I could see like the wheels turning in these kids' minds. And they came up with the sentence, fall is a season of change. And I just thought, it was like I was getting a window into learning, and seeing this teacher guide these students through this really complex process that we just expect kids to pick up on their own.
Well, I think, what really made a huge impact on me was how unprepared teachers were to teach writing, that they enter the classroom as newbies, or they've been teaching for decades, and they really don't know some fundamentals about what works with writing. And that was also true for a number of decades with reading. And as a young teacher many decades ago, I was right in there. I mean, I didn't really know what I was doing, and, just knew that I really loved being in front of a classroom and I loved the kids, but there was really no professional knowledge behind that would have helped me navigate what I had to do to really teach effectively. And as the years went on, and particularly when I became an administrator, it just was blindingly obvious that in this area, which is needed through life in every profession that you can think of, okay, in every profession, you need to write. And it goes from just taking notes all the way to a coherent email, an argument, doing some research on something. And the teachers really were not prepared to teach this as a result of the education that they got in their teacher training institutions. And so in most of their teacher training institutions, I should say. So I became, through my interactions with some very frustrated teachers who particularly began to be emerged as writing was assessed much more at the state level, and their children were not coming out so well, I became really interested in this, that without this particular skill, and without the skill reinforcing the knowledge that you wanted them to learn, you were really depriving them of a very important tool in life. And that's the story.
You both talked about the same thing in your stories, that writing is so hard and it has to be taught explicitly. It can't just be, oh, I'm going to assign a writing task and go write, and then you learn. I mean, before I read your book, I read almost every book on the writing workshop. And that's a great approach, but I'm realizing I actually never taught writing, how to write. I taught the process of writing, but I never taught explicitly, like, how do you combine sentences together? How do you expand sentences? How do you write a subordinate conjunction? I thought that was all just grammar, but it's actually now moving from grammar instruction to how do you communicate complex ideas clearly. That was your revolution for me.
That's good.
But Judith, would you tell me about how you started with Writing Revolution at your school? Because I know, and when I read your book, you talked about this started really at a school that you were working at. You were the head of school there. Can you tell us a little bit of background, and then how that became a book, and then how that became an article for the Atlantic?
How it became an article. Well, it was a school for learning and language disabled students, and teaching writing was a challenge. And one day, before I actually became the head of the school, I went to a workshop in New Jersey, which was about teaching writing to Spanish-speaking students, which might be of interest. They had a lot of migrants from Spanish-speaking countries, and teaching kids to write and getting these students ultimately into mainstream classes and away from ESL classes was the goal. And as I sat there and listened to them, I thought, first of all, I have to employ a lot of the things that they're talking about to the learning and language disabled kids, because writing in its own way is a second language, and that's not going to be easy for them to learn. And I went back and I began to experiment with what ultimately became a method of teaching writing. It's not a writing curriculum. It's a method of teaching writing that can be applied to any subject and to any grade. And it took a while, and I made some missteps along the way, but what really helped is that I always found time to be in front of a classroom actually teaching the kids, which is frankly what I enjoyed most about my job anywhere I went. And teaching the children taught me a lot. And then at a certain point, I went out and I decided that teaching writing was all I was interested in and was all I wanted to do. And one of the schools that I found myself in was a large high school in Staten Island, New York, of a few thousand kids, where many, many languages, 10 were spoken. And they began to implement this method, which got a tremendous amount of attention, including from a journalist who wrote mainly about education. And she wrote an excellent article, which came out of the Atlantic. And that was really the beginning of the organization, the Writing Revolution. And after that was around for a couple of years, I had the tremendous good fortune to meet Natalie Wexler. And she agreed to co-author a book, because we had a book about the method, but it really wasn't very comprehensive, to say the least. And someone suggested that it really should be memorialized. The method should be memorialized in a more comprehensive way. And I have to say, having Natalie in my life definitely made that possible, because I'm not the greatest writer in the world, but Natalie may be all the way up there. So that's how the Writing Revolution came to be, both the organization and the book, and the title, by the way, of the Atlantic article. We're not too creative about these titles, or we weren't at the time. So there you have it.
Natalie, do you want to add?
Well, I want to just add that I consider it to be my great good fortune to have met Judy Hockman. And I met her, I think, shortly before the Writing Revolution organization came into existence. And I asked if I could be on the board. And she said, "Oh, I was scared to ask you. I thought you might say no." Anyway, as a marriage made in heaven, I guess. And I have learned an enormous amount from Judy, just including about the importance of building kids' knowledge, which is the topic of this other book that I wrote all by myself, and that is intimately connected with teaching writing. You cannot teach writing in a sort of vacuum of content. It has to be embedded in rich content, preferably the content of the core curriculum, across the curriculum.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. You want to talk about that? Why, by the way, I listened to every single one of your podcasts for the Knowledge Gap podcast. I instantly, yes, the Knowledge Matters podcast. It was amazing. It was like NPR level quality. You had people snipped in there. You had multiple voices, multiple people. And I was like, how is she doing this? This is such excellent, high quality production of a podcast. It's like, no wonder you have so many reviews. And I tell people as much as possible to listen to that podcast. In particular, teachers who are working in schools where they get pulled out of social studies class and science classes to learn more English. And I'm like, stop. Please go listen to Natalie Wexler's podcast first, and then we'll come talk.
Well, thank you for that compliment. I have to say, I was as surprised as anyone that we actually managed to get it out and sounding as good as it did, because we did it in 3 months or so. I mean, it was just, and I kept saying, I don't think this is going to work, but I had, a team of people, recording engineer and people who knew how to put together a podcast. So I did basically write the scripts, and I did the voice, I was the narrator, etc. But it would, believe me, if I'd done it all by myself, it wouldn't have sounded like that. But yeah, no, and there is one episode in that 6-part series specifically looking at writing. And what surprised me, when I was interviewing 3 different teachers, and 2 of them said, without my knowing they were going to say this, well, I read The Writing Revolution, and that really changed my approach to writing. So there was definite overlap.
Would you tell us about very quickly, the research behind, like, why is content knowledge so important for writing instruction?
Yeah, well, for a couple of reasons, at least, and one is that you really can't write about a topic you don't know anything about, or even a tiny bit about. And we have in the United States, maybe elsewhere, these writing curricula that have been developed that have, kids get maybe 3 paragraphs to read about a topic, and then they're supposed to write an essay about that topic, or and they don't have enough information to write coherently. And we have an approach to literacy in this country that puts reading comprehension skills like finding the main idea of a text or making inferences in the foreground. And so the topics are not considered important. It doesn't really matter what the topic is as long as kids are practicing whatever the skill is. And what that leads to is not knowing very much about anything. And so with a curriculum like that, which is used in most schools in the United States, kids don't have anything that they can write about. And what I've heard over and over again from teachers who have switched to a curriculum that provides kids with rich content that like immerses them in a topic for several weeks, even if they're not using the writing revolution, they often say, oh, my kid's writing is so much better because they have stuff they want to write about and they actually know stuff. And, it's just like, it's common sense, right? That if you want kids to write, you have to provide them with enough information to equip them to do that. But the other thing about writing is that it is, in addition to being a valuable skill in itself, an incredibly potentially powerful lever for deepening and reinforcing the knowledge that kids are taking in from their reading or whatever in any subject. Because you just sort of know this at a gut level when if you've written about something, you understand it better, you remember it better. But I think a more sort of cognitive sciencey explanation is that writing is both a very powerful way of transferring new information to long-term memory and also practicing retrieving that information from long-term memory. And the more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. So, but also in writing, you are, if it's been taught explicitly and in a manageable way, you're constantly analyzing things, making connections between points of information, figuring out what something really means, and maybe sometimes discovering that you didn't know as much about it as you thought you did, and you need to go and find out more. So there are all of these things that writing does for learning. And we have, there's not a whole lot of good writing research out there, but we do have a meta-analysis of about 56 studies of having kids write about what they're learning, not in English language arts, but in social studies, science, and math. And what that meta-analysis showed that across the board, any subject, any grade level, when kids write about what they're learning, it boosts their learning. So we really need to pay attention to that.
Judith, you want to add to that?
Well, Natalie expressed it so perfectly, and it really is, we see writing to be in the service of knowledge, okay, of acquiring knowledge. And in thinking about the method that we wanted to use to facilitate this process, we thought about, well, what do kids need most in life? What are they going to be required to do as they move along through the grades? They're going to have to learn expository writing, writing that explains or informs. And I'm including argument within the expository framework. And without that, they're really handicapped in whatever they do, even if it's a brief email to an employer, if it's filling in an application and writing why they may want to work in a particular place, right up until the kind of assignments that they will get in post-secondary and secondary levels. And so we took the personal experience aspect, which is very common in some teachers who use the writing workshop model, and the journal writing and the poems and the memoirs, and figured, well, they're really not asked to show a journal very often, or show a poem to a prospective employer, or write a memoir on a college application, except in a specific area. So let's take those off the table. And let's just think about how do we get them to think to gain the knowledge that Natalie was referring to. And, there's our very popular strategy, but I think that it encompasses a lot of our thinking. Instead of saying the Industrial Revolution was an important event in the history of, you could say the Industrial Revolution was important because the Industrial Revolution was important, but, and there you go back to what Natalie was saying about the analytic part of how you set kids up to really think critically and the principles that we mention in the book can be applied through the grades and across the curriculum. So whether it's science or math or social studies, it shouldn't just live in the English classes. There should be a common language about speaking, about writing. And a lot of the teachers see that the things that we are trying to teach at a very granular level with writing appear in their oral language. And it was at this large high school in Staten Island that I used to hear kids I first really heard it there, with kids saying, and therefore, but however, and starting sentences with although, when they were making presentations, either in a moot court setting or what. And I thought, this has tremendous potential. And that's what I would add to it, actually.
Right. Well, you wrote in your book that in the introduction of your book, the school that you're talking about, there was such a low proficiency rate, but I think it was 50 something, and then it went up to 80 something.
Right.
And like that's why the person who wrote the Atlantic article was like, wait, that's unheard of with most schools. But the fact that you're working at a school for students with disabilities, the fact that they've jumped that much, we have to do a story on this.
Well, you're conflating the two schools. The high school, their proficiency level, their graduation level, even some behavioral issues when they started winning awards for their essays and all, were very impressive. With what happened at the School for Learning and Language Disabilities is that one of the goals of the school was to return students to mainstream classes. And when they did, in fact, return to mainstream classes, their performance in writing was actually better than the students in general education. So we found ourselves, we were giving courses in the method. We thought it would be mainly to resource room, ESL teachers, and so forth. No, we found many mainstream teachers begin to start taking our courses because, and then this is back in the special needs school. So this was very rewarding.
So I would just add that in addition to the statistics, and I think one of the strengths of that article and something that has happened again and again, I'm sure, since that article came out, was focusing on what it means for an individual student to go from not being able to put a coherent sentence together to being able to write a coherent argumentative essay, and what that does to the way they see themselves and what they're capable of doing and what they deserve from life and whether they should go to college and all of those things. It's really, it can be life-changing to teach a kid to write well.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like they know how to think, they just don't know the structure in which way to communicate it. And if we can give them those writing skills, those communication skills, then their brilliance will be seen. I think the brilliance of your book is that I used to be part of like the writing workshop method with like Ralph Fletcher, like the Ralph Fletcher, right? And at the end of the year, my students wrote more, but they did not write better. But I think with your writing method, my students are writing a lot, less than the before with the writing workshop, but they're writing more coherently. Like they're looking at full stops. The other day, we were working on like starting with a subordinate conjunction of when. And my student, who's a sleepier student, where we were writing on a Google Doc, and then they could see other students' sentences. That one sleepy student said, "Hey, where's your comma?" I almost fainted. I was like, you actually listened, and you actually thought about, hey, where's your comma in this sentence? And he was teaching someone else. And I was like, this is proof beyond proof that it works. Because what your book does is just so systematic. You start with, can we start with a sentence first? Like a full sentence, noun and predicate. So noun and predicate. And then let's move to expanding the sentence with because and so. And then let's move to subordinate conjunctions. And then let's move to taking notes. And then let's move to writing a paragraph. And then planning the paragraph and writing in composition. Your book is like the guide map for writing instruction for busy teachers who are like, I don't have time to think about the sequencing. You gave us the sequencing. And that's why your book has 2,000 plus reviews on Amazon. To have an education book have 100 is hard enough. The fact that there's a writing book out there that has 2,000 plus reviews, that's sacred writing, right? That's proof of the quality of your book.
Well, it certainly was a very pleasant surprise to Natalie and myself.
I was going to say,
And
we
I
did
think-
not expect it to be like a bestseller.
Right, I didn't think the publisher did either, Natalie. But here's the thing, left to their own devices, and not just students, many people will write the way they speak. They'll use the same structures, which are basically fragments and run-ons, and they're not really understanding the precisions and the structure necessary for written English. And so what Natalie and I really have tried to do is start at the most fundamental level. But I think that it's important to add two things in response to what, you've said. One is that we don't emphasize the labels, subject, predicate, subordinating. We emphasize those grammatical terms, particularly at the beginning of the process, that will enhance their writing. So if I were to say the sentence within a positive, which very few people I've found know what that is, but if I were to say, Tan, an excellent interviewer, met with Natalie Wexler and myself today. Well, nobody talks like that. The excellent interviewer is in a positive. It's a more enhanced description of Tan, right? So putting those things in writing moves them to structures that are not only more common in writing, but affect their reading comprehension, where Natalie has certainly become an expert in that area. I mean, I must have referred her podcast, which you referred to recently, to about 10,000 people at this point. And the thing is that those are the grammatical terms. So a little kid may know what a subordinating conjunction is or an appositive is, but they certainly won't know what a dangling participle is or a prepositional phrase, because that doesn't inform their writing to the extent the other things do. And the second point that I think is very important to make is that they can begin to develop outlines and structures for paragraphs while they're learning sentences, even as young as the primary grade, with the teachers doing most of the writing, but the students, through their oral participation, are doing the thinking and the work and seeing the structure of what the text of a paragraph would look like in outline form. And that's the foundation for really a lot of brain work in sequencing and organization. And Natalie certainly described the topics. The cognitive load of writing is formidable.
Do you want to add anything, Natalie?
Well, I just to build on that point that Judy made about how teaching kids to construct complex sentences can help their reading comprehension. I mean, this is something that reading comprehension research has not focused on enough, is that the complex, the syntax, the sentence structure of written language is almost always more complex than the syntax of spoken language. And so you can be a great decoder of words, you can have all those foundational reading skills. You could even have vocabulary, but if you're not familiar with complex syntax, that in itself can be a significant barrier to comprehension. I told a story that Judy heard me tell yesterday, but I'll tell it again because the rest of you haven't heard it, right? So this was a story I came across in a study of a 10-year-old boy who had average decoding ability, but he struggled with comprehension. And the researchers for some reason, read him aloud a sentence that said, Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And then the researcher said, so what do you know about Rachel Carson now? And the boy said, they grew up together in the same place, because he was not familiar with that structure and a positive. And he thought there were 4 different people in that sentence. There was Rachel Carson, there was a scientist, a writer, an ecologist, and they all grew up together. So teaching a student to construct in a positive equips them to powerfully to understand that kind of structure or subordinating conjunction or whatever when they encounter it in their reading.
When I read your book, you wrote it for teachers of multilingual learners, right? Because our students get placed into ESL service, and they have to place out of it. But to place out of it, they need to have academic language, which is predominantly evaluated through their writing. And so students write with the way they speak. But then this book is showing us how to transition students to the highest level of English language acquisition, where it's like, how do you write the way academics write? How do you write the way journalists write? How do you write the way historians write? And that's what we were missing. And this book really gives it to, really helps teachers of multilingual learners. How do we move to the highest phases of English language acquisition? So that's we have a huge debt of gratitude to you both.
Thank you.
And I should say, this is Judy's method. I helped her explain it, but I did not come up with it. This is, she definitely deserves the lion's share of the credit for this, if not 99% of it.
Go ahead, Judy.
I share the credit with a lot of people, including Natalie, by the way, with a lion's share. In standing in front of a classroom for so many years, you see the difficulty that some kids have saying too little, saying too much, not getting on point, and not making it easier for a listener or a reader to grasp meaning. And it's once you can appreciate how powerful writing is,
yes,
help kids do that, and to what an important tool it is in acquiring knowledge, which to us is the point of this. I mean, that's the point. What do you want them to graduate with? You want them to graduate with a knowledge base that can inform how they're going to make choices, and on a very large scale, how they might live their lives. Because without that knowledge, they're very handicapped in terms of their own literacy and in terms of their own interactions with others.
And I would just add, we've been talking about, academic language and being able to achieve in college, et cetera, but it's also, understanding a job training manual or,
right,
or a newspaper article, or those things use complex syntax and elevated vocabulary as well. And so this, or a lease agreement, a credit card, there are all sorts of things where you need to be able to understand those things. And suppose you want to challenge something on your credit card bill, you need to be able to write an argumentative, letter saying, this is wrong, and being able to explain that coherently. So these are not just academic skills and competencies, they are life skills and competencies.
So Natalie mentioned about your method, Judith. Would you like to share your method with us and your favorite strategies for writing?
Well, it's a little too much to share in the context of this platform, but its fundamental building block, the foundation of it, is the sentence. And as Natalie has very wisely mentioned, without the ability to construct decent sentences, you're not going to have a decent paragraph. You're not going to have a decent composition. And you're not going to be able to stand back metacognitively and revise your work. So the sentences has a great deal of importance to us, but so does the construction of an outline, and not just any outline, a linear outline, not webs, not Venn diagrams, but linear outlines where the students can see the structure of a text, a topic paragraph, a topic sentence, the support of that topic sentence, and the conclusion. And for the longer composition, what is the main idea of that composition? And does every piece of the that composition, the paragraphs, support that main idea? It's got to be a simple outline that they can replicate easily by themselves as they're confronting a situation where they may need to write a paragraph or an outline. And at some point, that format becomes embedded here so that their ability to organize and sequence information, as I mentioned earlier, is something that they're aware that they have to do. It's not a just right situation. It's a right this way situation. And they bring to it a level of knowledge about it that's terrifically important. And when the sentence activities are embedded in that, it becomes coherent. It becomes good communication with an audience. And that's essentially, we don't take too much for granted. Frequently, teachers are tell students to summarize something they've read or heard or seen even. You can't take for granted that they understand what summarizing looks like. You can't take for granted that they know how to write efficient notes, whether they're annotating a text or whether they're listening to a lecture. These things have to be taught. Later, they can own their notes and do what they want with it, but they've got to be taught why it's important and how to make it work for them. So as we move through this, I think with students and with the teachers who are really very empowered by learning this, it's gratifying to see the results of it. And they see the results pretty quickly because you are starting with the sentences. So you see students elaborating and expanding those sentences. Natalie often reminds that it's the same thing. But which it is, but expanding their remarks with the where and the when and the why instead of the monosyllabic answers that you might be more apt to get if you weren't stressing this in their writing, thinking of because, but, and so, thinking of in written form that it's good to start perhaps with a dependent clause, and later even maybe embed one or end with one. I mean, these are the things that we don't take for granted that children will pick up just from sitting in front of books. You don't become a good writer even when you're a good reader. There are things you really have to learn directly.
This is why like the multilingual heart of mine is like populating, because it's assume-aside is what happens to a lot of multilingual students. We assume they understand. And so therefore there's no explicit instruction. And then when we get the work back, we're like, well, sorry, you didn't do a good job. It's because we assume they should know. We assume they already come with this, but they really don't. And that your book is saying, here, don't just write, it's write like this. Natalie, do you want to add?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, Judy covered this well. I think when you're talking, what made me think of when you were talking about when you assume they know and you assume they understand, and not just understand like how to construct a sentence or a topic sentence, but I've done a little bit of teaching. In fact, I only adults, only highly motivated adults. So, it's not exactly the same ball game, but I actually, as a volunteer, taught English as a second language to adult immigrants here in DC. And I would say, so any questions? And like nobody would raise their hand. And I would think, oh, okay, so they understand. And then I get a quiz back and I'm like, no. And I think one thing that these writing activities, especially the sentence level activities, can do, if they're well designed, is uncover misunderstandings before it's too late, in a pretty efficient, targeted way. And you learn pretty quickly, not just whether they can construct the sentence in the way you had hoped, but also whether they actually understood the content that you have assumed they understood. Because, students don't always want to raise their hand and say, I don't understand, or they may think they understand when they actually don't understand. They have their own understanding. It's not what you intended.
You're saying when students write a sentence, it's formative data to say, oh, you don't understand that content, so we can't keep going on. Right? That's why writing has to be connected to content, because when students write, they get to synthesize the knowledge, but it also gives us formative feedback right away to say, oh, you didn't get this part, or oh, yes, you did get it. You were talking about some strategies. Would you share with us the sentence expanding strategies and the sentence combining strategies for listeners?
Natalie, yesterday, I think you gave a very excellent description of sentence combining. It's a relationship to knowledge acquisition or not,
Yeah.
and what it does accomplish.
So I'll do the sentence combining, you do the sentence expansion. Okay?
All right, that's a deal. That's a deal.
So sentence combining is one of the few sentence level strategies that has actually been researched and found to be beneficial in helping students, more beneficial than traditional grammar instruction in helping students construct complex sentences. And what it consists of is giving students maybe 3-4 simple sentences that they need to then combine into one complex sentence. And it could be done different ways. Maybe they could use in a positive, or they could use subordinate conjunction. They have to know how to use those things. So, that's great. But it is part of the method, the writing revolution method. But I would say it's not as powerful as some of the other strategies, because you're providing students with all of the information that they need in order to construct that complex sentence. It's right there. You don't need to retrieve information from long-term memory that you may have slightly forgotten and supply it and put it in your own words. So, for example, with that Rachel Carson example that I mentioned earlier, you could give students a sentence combining activity. It said, Rachel Carson was a scientist, Rachel Carson was a writer, Rachel Carson was an ecologist, and you put it all together. Rachel Carson, a scientist, writer, and ecologist, grew up in rural town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. But what you also could do is you could just give them a sentence missing in a positive. Rachel Carson, comma, blank, grew up in the rural river town of Springdale, Pennsylvania. And then they have to supply that a positive, which means they're not only learning about the structure of a positive, but they're reinforcing their knowledge of the content. So Judy, you want to talk about sentence expansion?
Yeah, really, sentence expansion is the most frequent type of the question words used in sentence expansion, who, what, when, where, why, and how, are the most frequent type of feedback we give when asking students in real life to revise their work. And our feedback is very explicit, and it's based on sentence strategies. And the reason that sentence expansion is used so frequently and is taken very seriously is because students make many assumptions about what the reader knows. And in their oral answers in class, they might give you something like, they fought. Okay, well, who fought? The colonists fought. When did they fight? During the Revolutionary War. Colonists fought. Why did they fight? To gain their independence from Britain. All right, not the greatest expansion I've ever done. But there's the point. In expanding that sentence, and particularly starting with when, which you can point out to students how much in expository writing you see, how often in expository writing you see sentences start with when. So if you want to try to write like a writer, try that more often yourself. They're forming a sentence that has a somewhat different structure and doesn't make the assumption that their reader or listener will know what they're talking about. This is so important. When you're writing, it's to an unseen audience. You don't always have a sense of how much they know or they don't know. And there's the assumption most of the time it's the teacher assessing their work. It's not a bad idea to give them ideas about practice writing to different types of audiences. That's another set thing. We call this very brief, unelaborated sentence that we give them a sentence kernel. They thought is a sentence kernel. It's a complete sentence. Total starts with a capital, ends with a period, expresses a complete thought, but it fails to give the kind of information that would be meaningful to a reader. And so there are many, many different contexts where that type of thing comes up in student writing. And it also is a great comprehension check, I might add.
Yeah, I love just all your strategies. Even, I mean, if teachers get just read just the first chapter, that is enough to change your practice. At the writing level, sentence expanding, sentence combining. I mean, when I read that first chapter, I stopped reading it, and right away I changed my instruction for this coming year. That's how powerful just writing at the sentence level was. Yeah. So I have my students now, when we finish watching a video or an article, they do because but so summary. So they'll write like, well, the honeybees benefit from flowers because the honeybees benefit from flowers, but the honeybees benefit from flowers. So now it's like a comprehension of like, oh, do you really understand that video? But now students are seeing that structure. It's just beautiful how you have taught that in your book. Let's move to three last questions. Let's talk about, how do we help students plan their writing?
I'll respond first, Natalie, and then perhaps we have linear outlines that they use for a paragraph and for 3 and 4 and 5 paragraph compositions. And outlining is planning. I mean, it's a way of thinking. For one of the most powerful reasons to have students outline their writing is it does reduce the cognitive load to a tremendous extent. And the linear outlines that we use in this method transfer very well, very easily to text. So they're able to see the beginning, the middle, and the end of where they're going. And based on that, and the fact that they've been taught to take notes so that they don't have a draft on their outline, they actually have an outline from which they can create a draft, is a tool that we have so much feedback about kids going on to college and still using the outlines because it's easy to replicate and it gets their thoughts. You know, one of the schools, Natalie's hometown, Washington, we had a little 6th grader say, "This outline just helps my brain." And, you know, it really said it all to us. We were so excited to hear that because honestly, it can help mine a little bit too if I used it more. So that's I think how planning works in our method. Natalie.
Well, I would certainly second all of that. And I know, I mean, I write all the time as, basically a professional writer, and I need outlines, because it's like wait, what was I going to say next? And did I already say that? And so you can offload some of that burden from working memory to screen or piece of paper, just something written that provides a roadmap for, where you're going, where you've been. And I think it also, if you just, there's a popular impression that kids should just flash draft, just let it all out and just write and write and write. And then, then what do you do? It's much more manageable to organize your thoughts on an outline. You don't have to rewrite the whole thing in a different, you can see in an outline, well, wait a minute, that point isn't really going to follow from this point. And it's much easier to rearrange things on an outline than when you've written like a 5-page draft of something.
that's the beauty of your book. You just make it so manageable. And when the instructions are manageable, students are less overwhelmed. And when they're less overwhelmed, they're more engaged in the learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's talk about our second question, the second to last question, which is how do we move from the instruction of the set paragraph level or sentence level to the paragraph to the composition?
Everything that we present in the book, which represents the method, of course, is built upon what you've done before. Okay, so moving to a composition from a paragraph is much easier, okay, if you've really put together the skills and it's not just handing children or your students an empty outline, a blank outline. There's a scaffold that you follow. And it's a scaffold that has a lot of, each step of the scaffold has a lot of value in itself. You follow the scaffold, and many steps of that scaffold are going to inform the composition. Have you stuck to the main idea? Are you writing in notes? Is your material sequenced and organized the way you want your work to be? You've done that at the paragraph level. I mean, for arguments, we have strategies where they can even begin at the sentence level to formulate sentence level, but then if you're telling them to write a pro paragraph, a con paragraph, well, you're laying the foundation for argument, aren't you? If you tell them to use a subordinating conjunction, although Carnegie and Rockefeller were great philanthropists, many considered them robber barons. I mean, when everything is building on everything else, and yes, you can cherry pick the strategy, certainly, and they will enhance your instruction a great deal. If you look at how the continuum of the method, moving from planning, from sentences to planning, to outlines for both paragraphs and compositions is really a very neat continuum. And as they're moving along, if they've been given sufficient practice, they will really move with quite a bit of facility.
Now, and I'll just add, yes, it's definitely a continuum. At the same time, though, it all works together.
Right.
So when students are learning to construct an outline, they're drawing on the sentence level skills they've acquired. They don't need to have acquired all of them, but they need to have acquired enough to create a topic sentence and the concluding sentence. And then when they're ready to move on a bit, and they can take those notes they have for details and convert those to sentences, again, drawing on the sentence level skills they've acquired. And for example, that might include using transitions to connect their sentences and make their thoughts flow, make their writing flow. And they may have learned how to use transitions in a different activity embedded in different content at the sentence level. For example, getting one sentence about, let's say it's embedded in content about the American colonies, followed by therefore, and then they have to supply the rest of that second sentence. So that is both introducing them to the use of transition words and phrases, which they'll use later on, and also deepening and reinforcing their knowledge of whatever content that sentence level activity is embedded in. And I will also add that it's a continuum, but it's also a recursive process. So you're not just teaching a positives and then that's it, we're done with the positives. You should go back to those positives in other content. You're going to be deepening other knowledge, but you're also reminding students about positives. And then when they're constructing, writing their paragraphs, they're able to use that strategy to vary their sentence structure, etc.
That's why Judith said the writing revolution is not a curriculum. It's tools to help students, an approach to help students communicate more clearly. Because I can teach students in a positive in this unit about Industrial Revolution, but when we talk about ecosystems, they can possibly use that again. It's just streamlined and so thoughtful. Okay, my final question is a 3-part question, and it's very easy. It's very brief. What would you, after all this work, after all these thousands of reviews, and apparently you did a webinar yesterday, all these workshops, What do you wish teachers start doing, continue doing in terms of writing instruction?
I'm not sure how I would respond is perhaps as direct as you might want. I'd love to see teachers be more empowered, have the confidence that they can approach what perhaps is the most difficult skill they have to acquire, their students have to acquire, with the knowledge of how to teach it most effectively. That it doesn't have to be a formidable dependence on every aspect of grammar. It doesn't have to be necessarily noted, focused on the student's own experiences, that it should be linked very closely to what they're teaching, and to be able to feel more satisfaction in the results of what they're teaching.
Yeah, I guess the way I might put it is, and I think, I want to make it clear that, the problems with writing instruction are not teachers' fault. It's a systemic problem. Teachers have not gotten good training or preparation on how to teach writing, and they themselves probably didn't get explicitly taught how to write. So they may not be confident of their own writing skills. And it's hard to teach something when you're not confident of what you're trying to teach. So this is not anyone's fault, but I think what we need to do is stop assuming that kids are just going to pick up writing if they read and write enough. They'll just, keep doing it, produce a volume of writing, and you will become a good writer. We need to start teaching writing much, much more explicitly, and beginning at the sentence level. And I think as far as what they should continue doing, every teacher I have ever met desperately wants their students to succeed. And obviously, it's not a question of teachers, they don't want their kids to become good writers. Of course they do. So they should continue having those high hopes and aspirations for their students, but combine those aspirations, those expectations, with the scaffolding, the instruction that kids actually need to meet those expectations.
This has been such an amazing podcast. I just wrote down all teachers want students to succeed, and I think through your book, you've made that possible by demystifying writing and liberating learning. So I am so indebted to both of you. If I had $1 million and I had one book to give away just for writing instruction, it would be your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's lovely to hear.
Thank you. Would you combine yourself to write a book on how to teach tenses, teach grammar?
That's another whole story. Yeah.
There's to a certain extent, there's got to just be correcting mistakes in students' own writing.
Absolutely. Yes.
Because that's really, sort of just explaining how tenses work. It's too abstract for most students. And it's been found that teaching grammar in the abstract like that, we've got studies going back 100 years showing it really doesn't work. It doesn't carry over to their writing. But that's one other reason to start instruction at the sentence level, because it's much more manageable if you have 1, 2, 3 sentences with tense problems, verb tense problems, instead of 5 pages full of them, then, it's easier for the teacher and the student to deal with that.
Well, again, thank you so much this has been the educational highlight of my year.
Well, this has been a very pleasant interview. Maybe I'll do more podcasts.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.